Welcome to the Inside Story. I'm Billy Hallowell, and today we have a very interesting story. It involves the Satanic Temple, a satanic symbol, and a decapitation of that symbol. We're going to get into all of that in just a moment here with John Brown. John, how's it going today?
Good, Billy. Good to talk to you.
It's good to talk with you. And this particular story is so bizarre and interesting on so many levels. It's surrounding this guy, Michael Cassidy, who is a Christian. He's a former political candidate, not currently running for office, but he went to Iowa. And something fascinating happened when he got to the Iowa Capitol and saw something that he knew was there. When he got there and he saw it, he really didn't like what he saw. Can you take us through what happened at the Capitol?
Right. So there was this display in the Capitol of what's called Baphomet, which a lot of people consider to be a demon of some kind. It's been a symbol in occult circles since the Middle Ages. And this famous magician called Eliphas Levi, who was really famous back in the 1800s, he did a famous drawing of him called the Sabbatic Goat, which a lot of people have probably seen. And I won't go into all the dark history, but basically it represents dualism and maintaining a balance between opposites like good and evil, male and female, which sort of takes on a different meaning amid the transgender debate.
Yeah.
But the huge statue that the Satanic Temple keeps putting up on government property with the kids that a lot of people probably know about is actually based on Levi's drawing. So this statue in the Capitol was basically a cheaper version of that. And it had a silver goat's head on a mannequin with a red cloak. And it also had like a wreath with an inverted pentagram. And then at the base of it, there was this altar with candles listing the 7 fundamental tenets of the Satanic Temple.
Now, it's interesting because, and I want to note this at the top, and I feel like I say this often. A lot of people don't realize it, but the Satanic Temple, they are not a theological Satanist group, meaning they do not worship a literal Satan. They don't believe that Satan exists. They don't believe that God exists. They're atheists essentially. Now, there's a whole theological conversation that we could have about whether or not they're still serving Satan in some way. As Christians, we could have that conversation, but we're not going to do that today. I'm just differentiating that there are people out there who do worship Satan in a theological sense. That is not the Satanic Temple, which makes the discussion and the debate even more interesting because of that. But again, that's another discussion. The thing I want to talk about next is you have Michael Cassidy. Again, he's a Christian. He saw on social media that this was happening in the Capitol. He ends up hopping on a plane and going to the Capitol to see this in person. What happened when he got there?
Yeah, I got to interview him yesterday. He told me that he flew up from Mississippi to Iowa last Wednesday, toppled the statue on Thursday, and then flew back. He's a Navy veteran, devout Christian. He said he felt called to push the statue over and tear its head off and toss it in the trash. And then he turned himself into police, who then gave him a 4th-degree criminal mischief charge.
Now, what does we're going to get into his reasoning, but what does a 4th-degree criminal mischief charge carry with it if he's found guilty?
It's the lowest degree of mischief in Iowa, but it's still a serious misdemeanor, and it applies to damage of property between $300 and $750. It could carry up to a year in prison and a fine of more than $2,500. So it's potentially pretty serious.
Yeah, it's a substantial, potentially a substantial life altering ramification, right? If he's found guilty of it. What is interesting about this case, Michael Cassidy is not out there claiming he didn't do it. He's not out there. In fact, he turned himself in to security on site once he did what he did. Once he tore the head off, decapitated it, and started to he even cleaned up some of his mess, which I thought was interesting. He threw out some of the trash that had gotten knocked around from when he took this action. But what did he tell you? Because I know the big question is why. Why did he do this? What did he tell you?
Well, he told me he didn't at first intend to do it, but he said when he got there, the display was a lot more disturbing in person than the pictures he had seen online. He said he almost thought about leaving, but he said he remembered what Jesus said about being ashamed of him and how Jesus warned against that and said, if you're ashamed of me, I'll be ashamed of you on Judgment Day. And he said that's ultimately what convinced him to do what he did. And he also said the Christians who defended the statue on constitutional grounds were overcomplicating things and that it really is just a simple matter of good versus evil.
So that is interesting, right? Because you do have two camps here. You have the camp that is saying, look, religious freedom means every religion, whether we like it or not, has to have some sort of presence there, and it has the right to have a presence there. And then some of those people would say you shouldn't be destroying other people's property. The other side, though, would have a very different view on this, that the Satanic Temple isn't a religious group because it's an atheist organization that essentially doesn't really believe. And even if they did believe, they're not a recognized group in these individuals' eyes. What is the public saying? What are politicians saying? I know that the governor of Iowa put out a statement. What is being said about this?
Well, a week before he did this, I actually interviewed State Rep John Dunwell, who is a Republican and a pastor, and he actually went viral on Twitter for a thread explaining why he didn't support removing the statue. And he's since called for Cassidy to be, punished for vandalism. But he told me that he would rather have an evil, blasphemous display or no display at all than have the state dictate what is appropriate, religiously. And then on the other hand, another state rep, Brad Sherman, who's also a pastor, he argued the opposite and said, this is in violation of who we are as a state, who we are as a people. And the Iowa State Constitution actually dedicated Iowa to God. And he pointed that out, and he called on the governor to remove it. And she didn't really do that, but she did basically say she objected to it.
Well, yeah, and the thing too, so people understand this, the reason that governors, and I'm not making an excuse here, I'm helping people understand, they don't want to end up in lengthy litigation in court over this when the idea in their mind is probably the courts are going to come back, whether it's right or wrong, and say they have a right to have this there. What is interesting about this is that at Christmas time, you've got a couple of holidays that are being celebrated. Generally speaking, there are only two religious holidays that are celebrated, and that would be Hanukkah and Christmas. And so when you're opening this up for holiday displays, it becomes a strange conversation. I've thought this often with the atheist displays that often happen at Christmas time, that this seems to be something that should be open to religions who are celebrating an actual holiday, not and this is, I guess it's my opinion, but not necessarily something that should be open to people mocking religion and faith, because that's what ends up sort of happening here. But again, that's a more complicated conversation that we can tackle here. One of the other institutions that I would love to know what they are saying is the Satanic Temple themselves. This was their display. How are they responding to Michael Cassidy's actions?
Well, they're furious. Their co-founder called it a hate crime. The Iowa chapter of their temple apparently intends to press charges. And then the night that it happened, CNN actually interviewed the co-founder, and he basically echoed Dunwell's arguments and said, he doesn't want to yield power to the government to begin picking and choosing between religious groups, even though some have argued that the Satanic Temple is not a real religion and therefore should not be given the same legal protections as other faiths.
Mm. Yeah, well, and that's where it gets interesting. Is this a religious organization? I think one of the things, at the end of the day, the Satanic Temple is also fundraising off of this, I would imagine, right? I would imagine they're getting a lot of press off of this as well. And so you have some really interesting dynamics there. But I know it's always hard to predict what happens next, but what do you think will happen next in this case?
Well, it's hard to say. I mean, Cassidy told me he's concerned about the potential consequences, even though he's not sorry about what he did. He was able to raise more than $80,000 for his legal defense fund. He actually raised 20,000 within a couple hours after the story broke. His lawyer has said that he hopes the citation will be thrown out because he argues that Cassidy was expressing his faith by what he did. But as we saw in Colorado, it's really hard to know what a court's going to do on any given issue these days.
Yes, that is true. And, it seems like so many things are, and I guess it was always this way, but it feels like the courts are really, really an active hyperdrive, and people are looking to them to solve so many of these issues. And as time goes on, the issues seem to get stranger and stranger. I mean, I feel like 10 years ago, we were talking about atheist displays. And again, the Satanic Temple is essentially an atheist group. But, the idea that these Satanist displays were going to be this prevalent and these after school Satan clubs were going to be this prevalent, I think 10 years ago wasn't even on our radar. And yet here we are, covering this story, and people can read more about the story. We went through the big details here, but John's got great content over at Christian Post that explains more of what is going on here. And I know you'll be on the story as it unfolds. John, appreciate your time today.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Everyone else, make sure you tune in next week for another episode of The Inside Story. We'll have another story we'll be breaking down for you. In the meantime, head over to Christian Post for all the news you need to read. We'll see you soon.